Have you ever noticed the most painful sound isn't a scream, it's silence? Not the peaceful kind that comes when the world is asleep, but the kind that echoes in your mind over and over when someone you hurt is simply gone. No explanation, no argument, no closure. Just absence. That's the silence that lives rent-free in the betrayer's head. Because here's the truth most people don't realize. When someone betrays you, they expect a reaction. They expect the storm, the angry texts at 2 a.m., the desperate phone calls, the endless explanations, trying to make them understand. They're ready for the shouting match. They're ready to see you break down. Why? Because your emotional collapse would make them feel powerful. It would confirm their illusion of control. In their mind, your rage, your sadness, even your tears are proof they still matter to you. But when you give them nothing, no anger, when you remove yourself entirely, quietly, gracefully, that's the one thing they were never prepared for. I want you to think about this. Silence isn't weakness. It's not giving up. It's one of the most strategic psychological moves you can make. In a world obsessed with noise, being calm and unreadable is a power move most people will never master. The ancient Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is not to become like the person who hurt you. And what is silence, if not the ultimate refusal to mirror their chaos? See, most toxic people operate in a loop of noise, over-explaining, over-talking, creating drama not to bring clarity, but to drown the truth. They use words as weapons and chaos as a shield. They thrive on pulling you into that chaos because the more reactive you become, the easier you are to control. So when you choose silence, you're not doing nothing. You're removing their oxygen. You're cutting off the very fuel that keeps their power alive. And suddenly, they're alone. Alone with their thoughts. Alone with their guilt. Alone with the reflection they've been running from. And here's the cruel beauty of it. Silence forces people to face themselves. It removes all the distractions, all the noise, all the excuses. There's no one left to blame, no story left to twist. It's just them and the truth they've been avoiding. I've seen this play out in real life. A friend of mine, let's call her Sarah, was betrayed by someone she loved deeply. He expected a fight. He expected her to cry, to beg, to demand answers. Instead, she packed her things in one night, blocked his number, and vanished from his world. No big speech, no social media posts, just gone. Months later, he reached out, not with an apology, but with confusion. He wanted to talk, to explain. She never replied. A year later, he sent another message, this time filled with nostalgia, regret, and that quiet desperation that comes when you realize the door is locked forever. Her silence had become his life sentence. That's the thing about silence. Done intentionally, it's not passive. It's surgical. It's a clean cut that stops the bleeding on your side and forces them to live with their wound on theirs. So, if you've been hurt, if you've been betrayed, remember this. You don't have to destroy them. You don't have to prove them wrong. You don't have to win in their eyes. Because the moment you stop giving them your energy, you've already won in yours. Silence doesn't scream, but it speaks. And sometimes, it says everything. Stay with me, because in this video, we're going to break down why silence isn't just a show of strength. By the end, you'll see why the calm, quiet path doesn't just protect your peace. It turns the tables in ways your betrayer will never admit, but will always feel. Here's something you need to understand. When someone betrays you, they're not just hoping for a reaction. They're counting on it. Why? Because your reaction is proof they still have influence over you. Your anger, your hurt, your desperate need to explain yourself, it all feeds their illusion of control. Think about it. In their mind, If you're still fighting, you're still connected. If you're defending yourself, you're still playing their game. And if you're chasing answers, you're still letting them set the rules. But what happens when you don't give them any of that? What happens when you stop talking, stop explaining, stop chasing? You break their entire psychological map. Manipulators operate like chess players who think they know your next move. They read your tone, your words, your reactions, and they adjust their strategy to keep you in check. But when you go silent, you flip the board. Now they can't predict you, can't read you, and that unpredictability terrifies them. And here's the irony. The moment you stop speaking, the conversation in their head gets louder. They start second-guessing themselves. They replay the last things you said. They wonder if you're planning something. They wonder if you've moved on. And the more they wonder, the more unsettled they become. Silence forces them into a place they hate their own mind. And if you've ever dealt with a manipulator, you know, their mind is not a peaceful place. Let me share a quick example. A client of mine, let's call him David, was in business with a partner who betrayed him. When David found out, everyone expected fireworks, lawsuits, public exposure, revenge. But instead, he took a deep breath, closed the partnership quietly, and disappeared from the picture. At first, his partner celebrated, thought he'd won. But as weeks turned into months, that victory started to rot. Because without David's presence, without his guidance, without his ideas, the business began to crumble. And worse than the financial loss was the gnawing realization that David didn't even care enough to fight. That absence spoke louder than any confrontation could have. That's the thing, silence is not passive. It's active. It's a choice. And it's one of the most intimidating boundaries you can set. When you stop explaining yourself, you're saying, I'm no longer giving you access to my energy. When you stop defending yourself, you're saying, my truth doesn't need your validation. And when you stop chasing, you're saying, you're not worth the peace I'd lose by staying in this fight. And here's the truth, most people miss silence is only powerful when it's paired with self-control. This isn't about sulking or giving the cold shoulder. This is about being so grounded, so secure in who you are, that you don't need to prove anything. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Silence is that principle in action. When you stop giving someone the reactions they're fishing for, you remove their ability to manipulate the narrative. They can't twist your words if you're not speaking. They can't weaponize your emotions if you're not offering them. But here's the part that really gets them. The silent boundary doesn't just block them, it exposes them. When you no longer engage, the spotlight turns inward. They're left facing themselves, with no one else to distract them from the truth. And that truth is often ugly. If you've ever had someone accuse you of being cold or cruel after you stopped engaging, that's just their fear talking. They're not afraid of losing you. They're afraid of losing the ability to control how they appear in your eyes. They can handle your anger because they can argue with it. They can handle your sadness because they can comfort or manipulate it. But your calm, your stillness, that's a wall they can't climb. So here's my question to you. Whose illusion are you still feeding with your reactions? And what would happen if starting today, you took back that power by choosing silence instead? I'm not saying it's easy. In fact, it might be one of the hardest things you'll ever do. But the moment you stop speaking into someone's chaos, you stop being part of their story. And when you step out of their story, they lose the script they've been using to control you. And that, my friend, is when the real panic sets in. Silence isn't just the absence of words. When it's intentional, it's a blade. Not the kind that cuts flesh, but the kind that cuts through illusions, false narratives, and the games people play. We've been taught to believe that speaking up is always the way to reclaim power. And yes, there's a time for that. But there's another level, a sharper tool that most people never learn to use: the surgical silence. This kind of silence isn't passive-aggressive. It's not about ignoring someone to make them chase you. That's just manipulation in disguise. No, this is the silence of someone who has decided, I no longer need to explain myself. I no longer need to defend my integrity to those who have already chosen to disrespect it. And when you reach that point, the game changes. In 8P, in the serve and masser, 1 hell P. See, toxic people thrive on access. They want your reactions, your energy, your presence. Even if it's through conflict, they feed off it. But when you remove that access completely, without theatrics, without threats, it's like cutting off the power to their life support. Let me tell you about a woman I knew, let's call her Maria. She worked in a high-stakes corporate environment and had a colleague who constantly undermined her, stealing credit for her work, planting seeds of doubt in the boss's ear. Everyone told her to fight back, to expose him publicly, but she didn't. Instead, she started documenting everything. Quietly, without confrontation, she built her own opportunities, strengthened her network, and kept her head down. And then one day, without warning, she accepted a position at a competing firm, one of their top rivals. She didn't say a word to him, didn't leave a speech on her last day. She just left. 6 months later, her old department was in chaos. The colleague who had undermined her was suddenly drowning because without Maria's stability, contacts, and behind-the-scenes problem-solving, the cracks in his own abilities became impossible to hide. She didn't ruin him. She didn't have to. Her absence revealed the truth. That's what surgical silence does. It doesn't swing wildly. It cuts clean. And here's why it works so deeply. Confrontation can give someone something to fight against, but silence gives them nothing. And in that nothingness, their own mind starts to turn on them. Every quiet moment becomes a mirror they can't escape. Every decision they made plays back in their head without your voice to interrupt it. It's like holding up a mirror and saying, I'm not going to tell you who you are. I'm just going to let you see it for yourself. And for many people, now I'm not telling you to go silent in every situation. Sometimes speaking up is the right move. But when someone has shown you who they are, when they've crossed a line and made it clear they're not acting in good faith, silence can be the most precise and effective tool you have. It's about refusing to descend into their chaos. It's about stepping out of their arena entirely. When you do that, you shift the entire power dynamic without ever raising your voice. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Silence is just as much about what you choose not to say as it is about what you do say. When you hold your tongue, you're making a choice to protect your peace, to preserve your dignity, and to let time and truth do the talking for you. And here's the bonus: silence travels. It echoes. Long after you've moved on, your absence becomes a story they tell themselves over and over. They start to wonder why you didn't fight, why you didn't try to win them back, why you seemed so unbothered. And that wondering, that's the seed of doubt that can grow into a forest of regret. So I'll leave you with this question. What would happen if, instead of trying to make someone see your worth, you simply stopped giving them the opportunity to question it? Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Silence does more than protect your peace. It reflects. When you go quiet, you're not just removing yourself from the noise, you're holding up an invisible mirror. And the person who hurt you is suddenly face to face with their own reflection. This is why silence feels so uncomfortable for them. Because for the first time, there's nothing to distract them from what they did. No arguments to twist, no emotional outbursts to point to and say, see, they're the problem. Just stillness. And in that stillness, the truth gets loud. Toxic people hate mirrors, not the kind you hang on your wall, but the emotional kind. They spend their lives running from self-awareness, avoiding any real confrontation with who they are. That's why they thrive on noise, drama, and chaos. As long as there's noise, they don't have to feel. As long as there's chaos, they don't have to think. But when you step back, when you stop reacting, when you stop giving them access, that chaos goes quiet. And in that silence, everything they've been trying to bury starts to resurface. Let me give you a real example. There was a young woman, let's call her Emily, who grew up with a narcissistic parent. Every argument was her fault. Every mistake somehow landed on her shoulders. For years, she tried to fix things. She explained. She defended herself. She worked harder to earn approval that never came. Then one day, she stopped. No angry letter, no dramatic announcement. And here's what happened. Her parent didn't find peace in her absence. They found exposure. With no one left to absorb the blame, no one to carry their emotional baggage, they were forced to sit with the truth. That's the power of the silent mirror. See, when you withdraw from a toxic dynamic, you remove their favorite coping mechanism, projection. Projection is when they take their own flaws, insecurities, or guilt and paste them onto you. You're too sensitive. You overreact. You made me do it. It's their way of avoiding responsibility. But projection needs participation. It needs your reactions, your explanations, your defense. The moment you stop giving them that, the moment you go quiet, their entire version of reality starts to collapse. And here's the thing, they may never admit it out loud. In fact, they'll probably double down publicly, insisting you're cold, heartless, or unforgiving. But behind closed doors, in the moments they can't fill with distraction, that silence eats at them. Because silence amplifies the truth. Think about it. When a room is noisy, you can hide a lot. But when the noise stops, you hear everything: the creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the clock, even your own heartbeat. Silence in a relationship works the same way. It amplifies what's been there all along. For the person who wronged you, it amplifies guilt, regret, and shame. And for you, if you're willing to embrace it, it amplifies clarity, self-worth, and peace. Now, I'm not saying silence will magically make someone change. In fact, most toxic people won't suddenly become self-aware just because you stop talking. But it does something far more important. It frees you from their narrative, and it leaves them with no choice but to live inside their own. And here's where the Stoic perspective comes in. The Stoics didn't believe in chasing justice through endless confrontation. They believed in living in a way that aligns with virtue, letting your actions, or in this case, your absence, be the teacher. Your silence says, I refuse to carry your guilt for you. I am not your emotional punching bag. My life will not be built around cleaning up your chaos. And you don't have to deliver those lines in a dramatic speech. You deliver them by living well without them. So if you've walked away from someone who betrayed you, and you're wondering if they notice, if they feel it, believe me, they do. They may not feel it in the way you think. It's not always about missing you personally, it's about missing what your presence allowed them to avoid in themselves. Your silence is their mirror. And every time they look into it, they're reminded of the truth they've been running from. The question is, will you stay quiet long enough for that mirror to do its work? Detachment. It's one of those words people misunderstand. They hear it and think it means you've stopped caring, that your heart has gone cold, that you've built walls no one can break through. But real detachment is nothing like that. True detachment is not about feeling nothing. It's about not being ruled by what you feel. It's emotional intelligence in motion. The ability to experience anger, sadness, even betrayal, and still respond in a way that aligns with your values, not your impulses. The Stoics mastered this. They didn't deny emotions. They just refused to let emotions drive the chariot. Marcus Aurelius didn't say, feel nothing. He said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." And here's why this matters. The more emotionally entangled you are with a manipulator, the more control they have over your internal state. But the moment you detach, truly detach, you reclaim that power. Think about it like this. When you're tangled in their drama, every word they say, every look they give, becomes a lever they can pull to move your emotions. They can make you doubt yourself, question your worth, or feel guilty for setting boundaries. But when you step back, when you remove that emotional leverage, they're left pulling on strings that no longer connect to anything. And that drives them crazy. Let me give you an example. There was a man, let's call him Tom, who had a friend that always seemed to be in a crisis. Every week it was a new emergency, a betrayal, a conflict, a disaster that needed fixing. And Tom, being the loyal friend, always stepped in to help. He spent hours giving advice, lending money, cleaning up messes, until one day, he didn't stop caring. He just stopped being the automatic rescue team. He didn't reply to the late night panic texts. He didn't jump in to fix the situation. He sat with himself instead. And something interesting happened. The mask fell. That friend didn't actually want resolution. They wanted an audience. They didn't need support. They needed control. And without Tom's constant attention, the chaos lost its stage. That's detachment. It's not abandonment. It's clarity. In Go, when you detach, your mind clears. Emotional chaos clouds judgment. You overthink. You replay conversations. You second-guess your decisions. But detachment sweeps away the fog. Suddenly you see patterns for what they are. You recognize manipulation tactics without getting sucked in. You can tell the difference between genuine connection and emotional blackmail. And here's why manipulators fear detachment more than anger. Anger is still engagement. Anger still says, "You matter enough to make me feel this." But detachment says, "You no longer have access to my peace." It's the emotional equivalent of changing the locks. Now, don't confuse this with indifference. You can love someone deeply and still walk away when that love costs you your sanity. You can forgive someone silently and still never let them back into your life. That's not cold, it's wisdom. It's the recognition that protecting your inner world is not selfish. The truth is, detachment is hard, especially for people who are natural givers, empaths, or peacemakers. We're taught that caring means staying, even when it hurts. But that's not compassion, that's self-abandonment. A Stoic doesn't harden their heart, they strengthen it. They don't isolate themselves, they choose carefully who gets access. They don't detach out of spite, they detach out of respect for their energy, their sanity, and their sacred inner world. And once you learn the art of detachment, you stop chasing closure from people who will never give it. You stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop watering dead plants. Because here's the secret. Detachment isn't the end of love, it's the beginning of self-respect. So I'll ask you, when was the last time you didn't react and it changed everything? When was the last time you said nothing, walked away, and watched the storm collapse without your participation? That wasn't weakness. That was your higher self speaking. That was detachment doing its job. That was you choosing peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, and self-mastery over self-sacrifice. And the more you choose detachment, the more unshakable you become. Not because life gets easier, but because you stop letting other people's storms dictate your weather. In a world addicted to reaction, detachment is rebellion. And in your rebellion, you find freedom. Anyone can react. That's easy. Someone pushes your buttons and you push back. Someone throws a jab and you throw one harder. The world is full of people who run on emotional autopilot. But mastery lives in the pause. The ancient Stoics taught that the space between stimulus and response is where freedom lives. It's in that breath, that split second, where you get to decide, is this worth my energy? When you're operating without discipline, your emotions drive the car. Anger takes the wheel. Pride hits the gas. And before you know it, you're miles down a road you never wanted to travel. But when you master the art of non-reaction, you're no longer the passenger, you're the driver. And here's the thing. Non-reaction doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you let people walk all over you. It means you choose your battles with precision. You don't swing at every pitch because you know not every pitch is worth swinging at. Let me tell you about a moment that stuck with me. A man I knew, let's call him James, was at a family gathering when a relative made a cruel, cutting remark about him in front of everyone. You could feel the room freeze. Everyone waited for the explosion. James had every right to fire back. But instead, he took a slow sip of his drink, smiled politely, and changed the subject. The rest of the night, the person who made the comment looked more and more uncomfortable. Why? Because James didn't give them what they wanted, a scene. His stillness turned the spotlight right back on them. And long after that night was over, people remembered the dignity James showed, not the insult that was thrown. That's the power of restraint. See, manipulators and toxic people depend on your reaction. Your reaction becomes their oxygen. It keeps the argument alive, keeps the drama running, keeps their narrative intact. But when you don't react, you suffocate the fire. And here's something I've learned. The moment you explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you've already lost energy. You've given them the satisfaction of knowing they can pull you into their chaos. Self-mastery is about protecting that energy like it's your most expensive currency, because it is. You don't spend it on people who devalue you. You save it for your healing, your growth, your future. The discipline of non-reaction is not about avoiding conflict out of fear. It's about avoiding pointless conflict out of wisdom. You're not afraid to fight, you just refuse to fight battles that cost you more than they're worth. And here's where the psychological magic happens. When you stop reacting, you shift from being predictable to being unreadable. People who once thought they could push your buttons suddenly find themselves pressing air. They can't manipulate what they can't measure. This doesn't just throw them off, it forces them to sit with their own discomfort. And as we've said before, that's the one thing they can't stand. But here's the challenge: non-reaction takes training. You don't wake up one day perfectly zen. It's a muscle you build. And like any muscle, it grows through repetition. Every time someone tries to provoke you and you choose to breathe instead of lash out. Every time you feel the urge to set the record straight, but you decide your peace is more valuable. Every time you pause, think, and respond with intention instead of impulse, you're strengthening that muscle. And before you know it, you've built an inner fortress. Not because nothing can touch you, but because nothing can shake you. Think about it. The world rewards speed. Social media wants instant reactions. Headlines want outrage. Everyone's racing to be the loudest. But in that noise, calmness becomes rebellion. And in that rebellion, you become unshakable. So, the next time someone tries to pull you into a fight, pause. Ask yourself, is this worth the cost? If the answer is no, don't pay the price. Walk away with your dignity intact. Because the strongest people aren't the ones who win every argument, they're the ones who don't need to argue in the first place. And in that silence, in that refusal to be moved by every gust of wind, you'll discover something rare. When most people think of punishment, they think of something loud. Arguments, public call-outs, legal battles, revenge plots. But some of the most devastating punishments, silence, when it's intentional, is not emptiness, it's a verdict. And for someone who's betrayed you, it can be the harshest sentence they'll ever serve. Here's why. When you react, when you yell, when you fight, you're still giving them a role in your story. You're still saying, you matter enough for me to spend my energy here. And whether they admit it or not, that keeps them relevant in your life. But when you go quiet, when you disappear without theatrics or explanation, that's when the real punishment begins. Because now, they're alone with themselves. And that's a room they've spent their whole life avoiding. See, manipulators and betrayers are skilled at shifting blame. If you argue, they'll paint you as unstable. If you cry, they'll call you overly sensitive. If you defend yourself, they'll twist your words until you start doubting your own memory. But silence? Silence leaves them nothing to work with. They can't twist words you didn't say. They can't frame you as the villain if you've walked away without a scene. They can't soothe their guilt with your emotional reaction because you've given them none. And so, the guilt just sits there. No outlet, no distraction, no one to carry it for them. I remember a story about a woman, let's call her Claire, who was in a long-term relationship. One day she found out her partner had been lying to her for years. She didn't scream. She didn't beg for an explanation. She didn't even ask why. She simply packed her things, walked out the door, and never contacted him again. At first, he bragged to friends about how unbothered he was. He moved on quickly, posted happy pictures, flaunted a new relationship online. But months later, those posts slowed. And late one night, he sent her a message not to apologize, but to explain himself. He wanted to rewrite history, to paint himself in a better light. She never replied. Over the next year, the messages trickled in. I've been thinking about you. Remember when I just want to talk. But she stayed silent, and that silence became his prison. Because it didn't just represent her absence, it represented the fact that she had moved on, built a life, and closed a chapter without him in it. That's the invisible sentence. Knowing you no longer have access to someone you once had full access to. Knowing they no longer think about you when they wake up, or care about your opinion, or need your approval. It's a loss that can't be measured in material things. It's measured in the quiet moments when there's nothing to distract them, and your absence feels louder than your presence ever did. And here's the psychological twist. Your silence forces them to confront the possibility that they were the problem all along. When you're gone and their life doesn't get better, when the peace they imagine never comes, they're left wondering, was it me? And deep down, they know the answer. This is why I tell people, you don't need to plot revenge. You don't need to expose them. You don't need to win some public battle. All you have to do is leave the stage. Because once you're gone, they can no longer distract themselves with the drama. They can no longer point the finger outward. And the silence you leave behind becomes the backdrop against which their own actions replay over and over without mercy. And here's the part most people miss. Silence as a sentence doesn't just happen. It's a conscious choice. It's the decision to say, my peace matters more than your punishment. You're not staying quiet because you're afraid, you're staying quiet because you've already won. It's not about making them suffer. It's about refusing to suffer yourself by staying connected to someone who has shown you they can't be trusted. And yet, the irony is that in freeing yourself, you create the very consequence they can't escape. Because the absence of your voice becomes the loudest voice in their head. So, the next time you're tempted to give someone a piece of your mind, ask yourself, would my words change anything? Or would my silence do more? Because sometimes, the most devastating thing you can say is nothing. Here's a truth that might surprise you. When someone lashes out at you after you've gone silent, it's not always because they hate you. Often, it's because they can't stand what your absence is forcing them to feel. See, guilt is a tricky emotion. It's heavy, it's suffocating, and for some people, it's almost impossible to sit with. So instead of facing it, they try to get rid of it. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to flip it into anger. Why? Because anger feels powerful. Anger gives them a target. Anger lets them blame someone else. And if they can get you to react, if they can provoke you into defending yourself or explaining, they can temporarily transfer that guilt right back onto you. Now, instead of sitting in shame, they get to say, "See, you're the problem." It's a psychological sleight of hand. Let me give you a real example. A man, let's call him Robert, cheated on his partner and got caught. She didn't yell. She didn't make a scene. She simply told him it was over, packed her things, and walked away. No public drama, no long texts, no social media blasts. At first, Robert played it cool, told friends he was relieved and moving on. But as the weeks went by, the weight of what he'd done started to creep in. And instead of facing that weight, he began picking apart the breakup in his mind. Soon, he was telling anyone who would listen that she was heartless and selfish. He even sent her a message accusing her of being toxic for not hearing him out. Sound familiar? That's guilt in disguise. That's someone who can't stand looking in the mirror, so they try to smash it by making you the villain. And here's the part that can be hard to accept. The calmer you stay, the more that guilt festers. You're not feeding it with excuses or emotional outbursts. You're not giving them a reason to let themselves off the hook. And that's when the anger spikes, because they're desperate for relief, and your silence isn't giving it to them. From a Stoic perspective, this is why restraint is so important. If you react to their anger, if you defend yourself, if you try to explain, you give them exactly what they need, an escape from their own conscience. But if you remain grounded, you force them to keep sitting in the very discomfort they're trying to outrun. Marcus Aurelius said, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." In this case, being unlike them means refusing to turn your hurt into a weapon. Now, don't get me wrong, silence isn't about pretending nothing happened. It's about refusing to let someone else's inability to manage their guilt pull you back into chaos. You can acknowledge the truth without giving them a stage to rewrite it. And here's the paradox. The more at peace you are, the louder their storm becomes. They'll accuse you of being cold. They'll say you're avoiding responsibility. They might even mock your calmness, hoping to break it, but deep down, they know the truth. I've seen this happen over and over. The ex who calls you selfish because you won't meet for closure. The family member who says you're holding a grudge because you stopped engaging in toxic conversations. The former friend who tells everyone you changed because you no longer let them take advantage of your time. In each case, the anger isn't really about you. It's about the reflection they see in your silence. So what do you do when this happens? You hold the line. You remind yourself, their reaction is about their conscience, not your character. You don't take the bait. You don't step back into the ring just because they're throwing punches at the air. And here's the best part: over time, the storm runs out of energy. Without your participation, their narrative collapses. They can keep talking, but it won't change the fact that you're not listening. They can keep blaming, but it won't erase the fact that they were the ones who lit the match. Your silence is not just the absence of noise, it's the presence of strength. And nothing frustrates a guilty conscience more than realizing they can't shake you. So if someone's anger flares up after you've walked away, take it as confirmation. The mirror you left behind is working. And the only thing left for you to do is keep walking. If you've ever dealt with a manipulator, you know this. Their power over you isn't always physical, financial, or even social. Most of the time, it's psychological. They control you by controlling the narrative. They twist your words. They question your memory. They turn your reactions into proof that you are the problem. And the more you try to defend yourself, the deeper into their web you get. This is why silence is so powerful, because it cuts through that web in one move. When you go silent, you take away their ability to steer the conversation. They can't misquote you if you haven't spoken. They can't distort your tone if you haven't raised your voice. They can't bait you into a fight if you refuse to step into the ring. And here's the part they never see coming. Without your participation, their control starts to crumble from the inside out. Let me give you an example. There was a woman, let's call her Hannah, who worked under a boss notorious for gaslighting employees. If someone made a mistake, he'd pin it on them, even when it was his fault. If they pushed back, he'd claim they were overreacting or misremembering. Hannah watched coworkers burn out one by one. She knew that confronting him head-on only gave him more material to twist. So she did something different. She went silent. She stopped defending herself in meetings. She stopped over-explaining her choices. She kept her communication short, clear, and documented. And when he tried to provoke her, she responded with calm, factual statements or nothing at all. Over time, something shifted. Without the emotional energy to feed on, the boss's tactics started falling flat. Other people began noticing the inconsistencies in his story. His influence started to weaken. And eventually, his reputation, not Hannah's, was what crumbled. That's the thing. Manipulative people thrive in noise because noise is easy to manipulate. But silence? Silence forces them to deal with reality, and reality is rarely on their side. Now, I'm not saying staying silent is easy. In fact, it can be one of the hardest things you'll ever do, because your natural instinct will be to defend yourself. You'll want to set the record straight. You'll want to prove they're wrong. But here's the harsh truth. The more you engage, the more you feed the system they've built. And you can't win a rigged game by playing it. You win by walking away from the table entirely. From a Stoic perspective, this is about boundaries. The strongest boundaries aren't always spoken, they're felt. They're in the way you stop giving someone access to your emotions. They're in the way you no longer allow your peace to be disrupted just because someone else is in chaos. And this is where your silence becomes more than self-protection, it becomes a form of quiet justice. Without you as their emotional puppet, they lose their grip. Without you reinforcing their version of events, their lies start to collapse under their own weight. It's like pulling the plug on a machine. At first, it might keep spinning on stored energy, but sooner or later, it stops. And when it does, here's what often happens. The manipulator will try harder. They'll provoke you more aggressively. They'll spread rumors. They'll act out in ways designed to force you back into the game. But if you stay calm, if you refuse to take the bait, they run out of moves. This is why silence isn't just the absence of words, it's the ultimate shift in power. Because it says, you no longer control how I feel. You no longer control what I do. You no longer control the story I live by. And here's the part I want you to really hear. You don't have to convince anyone else to see the truth. The truth has a way of revealing itself when you stop trying to force it. People will notice the difference between your calm and their chaos. They'll see the contrast, and in time, that contrast speaks louder than any argument ever could. So if you've been stuck in a battle you can't seem to win, ask yourself, what would happen if I stopped playing altogether? Because sometimes the smartest way to win is to stop letting them keep score. Silence is never just silence. Not when it's intentional. Over time, it becomes something far more powerful. It becomes a reminder. For the person who betrayed you, your absence starts as a relief. They convince themselves they've moved on, that they're free, that life will be lighter without you. And maybe at first, it feels that way. The drama's gone, the tension's gone, they think they've won, but silence has a way of echoing. Weeks pass, months pass, and in the quiet moments when they're not surrounded by friends, when the music's turned off, when they're lying in bed at night, your absence shows up like a shadow in the corner. They remember your voice, your presence, the way you carried yourself. They remember the calm you brought to situations that used to spiral. And slowly, the truth begins to creep in. They didn't just lose a person, they lost the stability, the depth, and the peace you brought into their life. It's in those moments that your silence turns from absence into presence. because the human mind doesn't let go of what was real. It replays it, especially when it realizes there's no way to get it back. Let me give you an example. There was a man, let's call him Ethan, who left his wife for someone more exciting. He thought he was upgrading, chasing passion, chasing freedom. But 6 months later, the relationship that felt thrilling in the beginning was now exhausting. The constant drama, the lack of trust, the instability, it all wore him down. One night, in a rare moment of honesty, he reached out to his ex. He didn't apologize, he didn't beg. He just said, "I didn't realize how peaceful my life was until I lost it." She never replied. She didn't need to. Her silence was the reply, and in that silence, Ethan heard everything he needed to hear. That's the thing about silence. It doesn't rush, it waits. And while it waits, it works quietly in the background, turning into a mirror that gets harder and harder for them to look away from. From a psychological standpoint, this is called cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort people feel when reality doesn't match the story they've been telling themselves. If they've been telling themselves you were the problem, your absence dismantles that lie. Because if you were the problem, why isn't life better without you? And here's where it gets interesting. Your silence doesn't just remind them of you, it reminds them of themselves. It forces them to face the version of themselves they were when they had you, and the version they've become without you. That contrast is brutal. They may try to drown it out with distractions, new relationships, constant posting on social media, keeping themselves busy. But all it takes is one quiet night, one familiar song, one random scent, and the echo of you is right there, reminding them of what they threw away. This is why you don't need to chase, you don't need to prove, and you don't need to fight for acknowledgement. Because silence delivers the message for you slowly, consistently, and in a way that hits when they least expect it. The Stoics would call this the justice of nature. You're not punishing them, you're simply allowing the truth to live without interference. And truth left alone always finds its way in. Your silence says, "I'm not coming back. You no longer have access to me. The peace you feel missing is the peace I once gave." And here's the most important part. This reminder isn't meant to haunt them for your satisfaction. It's not about hoping they suffer. It's about living so fully, so peacefully, that your life itself becomes proof you didn't need them to thrive. So if you've walked away and stayed silent, trust this: the echo is there. Whether they admit it or not, they hear it. And in their most unguarded moments, they feel it. The question is, will you keep giving that silence the space to work? Because the longer you do, the more that silence shifts from being about them to being about you, your healing, your growth, and your unshakable peace. One of the most dangerous traps after betrayal is believing what you see. Especially in the age of social media, appearances can be weaponized. You walk away from someone, and suddenly their life looks perfect. They're posting pictures of vacations, fancy dinners, new relationships. They're laughing louder than ever, surrounded by people, living what seems to be their best life. And if you're not careful, you start to question yourself. Did I make a mistake? Are they really happier without me? Was I the problem all along? But here's the truth. A truth the Stoics understood thousands of years ago. Appearances are deceptive. What you see is rarely the full story. The Stoics taught us to look beyond the surface, to measure life not by what it looks like, but by the peace it produces. And peace can't be faked for long. A calm soul doesn't need to prove anything, but a restless one, it seeks constant validation. And that's the first sign something's off, when someone goes out of their way to broadcast how happy they are, especially right after a breakup or betrayal. It's not always confidence. Sometimes it's panic. Let me give you an example. There was a woman, let's call her Lisa, who left a long-term partner in the most dignified way possible. No fights, no public drama. She simply walked away after realizing the relationship was built on lies. Within days, her ex was flooding social media with pictures of a new love, expensive gifts, and over-the-top declarations of happiness. Friends sent Lisa screenshots. Some even asked if she was okay seeing him move on so fast. Lisa just smiled. She knew something they didn't, because behind the curtain, that relationship was already cracking. The oversharing wasn't a sign of genuine joy, it was a distraction. A performance designed to convince the world and himself that he was winning. 6 months later, the post slowed. The smiles looked forced, and then they stopped altogether. That's what the Stoics would call an illusion, a story someone tells the world to avoid facing the one inside themselves. Marcus Aurelius said, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." In other words, it's not the pictures that hurt you, it's the meaning you attach to them. When you start to see through the illusion, you realize something important. External noise doesn't equal internal healing. A person can look like they're thriving while quietly falling apart. In fact, the more effort someone puts into proving they're over you, the less likely they actually are. True peace is silent. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't post for validation. It simply exists. And here's where your silence becomes even more powerful, because while they're performing happiness, you're building it. You're not competing. You're not trying to outsmile them on social media. You're living in a way that feels good on the inside, not just looks good on the outside. That's the Stoic advantage. You stop measuring your worth by how you compare to someone else's curated highlight reel. You measure it by your own inner stability, your own growth, your own alignment with your values. So, the next time you see someone flaunting their perfect life after hurting you, ask yourself, does this look like peace, or does it look like performance? And then remember, the Stoics would tell you not to get distracted, because whether they're genuinely happy or just pretending, it doesn't change your path. Your job isn't to track their healing. Your job is to build your own. Let them chase applause. You chase alignment. Let them seek validation. You seek peace. Because in the end, when the noise fades and the lights go out, it's not the audience's opinion that matters. It's the quiet truth you feel when you're alone. And if that truth is peace, you've already won. There's something terrifying about a door that closes and never opens again. Not because you slammed it shut in anger, but because you quietly locked it and walked away knowing you'll never walk back through. That's what silence can become. A wall. Not a wall built out of spite, but a wall built out of clarity. When someone betrays you, they rarely believe the relationship will end completely. Deep down, they expect that eventually you'll pick up the phone. You'll respond to that late-night text. You'll give them just one more conversation. They believe no matter what they've done, the door will always be there if they decide to come back. But when your silence becomes consistent, when weeks turn into months, and that door stays closed, they start to understand. This isn't a pause. This is permanent. And that realization, it hits harder than any argument ever could. Let me give you an example. A man named Daniel was married for 12 years. When his wife found out he'd been hiding financial lies from her lies that put their future at risk, she didn't explode. She didn't threaten. She didn't even demand an explanation. She packed her things, moved out, and never once reached out. At first, Daniel thought it was just space. He assumed she needed time to cool off and would eventually want to talk. But as the months passed, the silence stayed. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed without a message. And that's when it sank in. She wasn't coming back. He later told a friend, "I thought the worst thing would be her yelling at me. I was wrong. The worst thing is knowing she's gone, and I can't reach her anymore." That's the silent wall. It's not built overnight. It's built through every decision you make to protect your peace over reopening old wounds. It's built when you delete the message draft instead of sending it. When you choose to keep your distance instead of meeting just to talk. When you stop letting nostalgia override the truth of how they treated you. And here's the thing, the silent wall is not for them. It's for you. It's the boundary that keeps you from slipping back into cycles you've already escaped. It's the reminder that once you've outgrown chaos, you can't shrink yourself to fit back into it. From a Stoic perspective, this is indifference at its highest form. Not the cold kind, but the wise kind. Marcus Aurelius said, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." Closing the door without rage, without theatrics, without the need for revenge is exactly that. You're not punishing them, you're protecting you. And here's the paradox. The softer you make your exit, the harder it is for them to process. If you left screaming, they could blame your anger. If you left in drama, they could tell themselves you were unstable. But when you leave in peace, when you close the door and vanish into a better life, they're left with no excuse, only the truth. This is why the silent wall is so unshakable. It's not made of stone or steel, it's made of decisions. Every time you choose silence over reaction, boundaries over access, clarity over closure, because the wall isn't around you, it's within you. And that's the part they'll never be able to tear down. So, if you're wondering whether you should crack the door just to see or just to check in, remember this. Every time you open that door, you give them a foothold. Every time you answer, you hand them a ladder. And before you know it, they're back in your space, rearranging the furniture in your mind. You didn't build the silent wall to punish them. You built it to protect the peace you fought so hard to find. And if they stand on the other side, pounding, shouting, pretending they don't care, let them. Because the more they try and fail to get through, the more they realize the truth. You're not just gone from their life, you're gone from their future. Karma. It's a word people often misunderstand. Some imagine it as an instant lightning bolt, something dramatic and obvious. But in reality, karma often works quietly, almost invisibly. The Stoics weren't religious, but they understood something similar. They believed in the natural order, in cause and effect, in the principle that what you put into the world eventually returns to you. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What injures the hive, injures the bee." In other words, when you harm another person, you harm yourself whether you realize it in the moment or not. Betrayal doesn't just break trust, it fractures a person's own alignment with truth. And when you live out of alignment, you will eventually feel the weight of that fracture. But here's the thing, karma doesn't always arrive as punishment. More often it shows up as patterns. If someone betrays a kind, loyal person, they might find themselves surrounded by people who are disloyal to them. If they mock someone's silence, they might one day need someone's forgiveness and be met with silence themselves. If they destroy someone's trust, they may live the rest of their life unable to trust anyone. That's karma, not a cosmic judge slamming a gavel, but the simple reality that you can't run from the consequences of your own patterns. Let me give you an example. There was a man, let's call him Victor, who left his longtime partner for someone else, convinced he'd found true happiness. For a while, everything seemed perfect, but 6 months in, cracks started to show. Arguments, suspicion, and instability took over. One night, after yet another fight, he found himself lying awake at 2 a.m., remembering the peace he once had, the stability, the trust, the calm. And it hit him he hadn't just lost a partner, he'd lost the part of himself that could rest at night. That's karma. Not because his ex wished it on him, but because his own choices planted the seeds. And now he was living in the garden he'd grown. From a Stoic perspective, this isn't about hoping for someone's suffering, it's about understanding that no one can violate truth without eventually paying the internal price. The external world might still look fine, they might still smile in public, but inside the unrest grows. And here's where your silence fits in. When you step away, you stop protecting them from the natural consequences of their actions. While you were in their life, you absorbed some of that weight. You carried the stress, the confusion, the emotional fallout. But when you leave, they're left to carry it themselves. At first, they might not notice, but over time, the weight becomes undeniable. That's why you don't need to chase justice. The Stoics would tell you, focus on your own alignment. Because while they're trying to rebuild with cracked tools, you're building on a solid foundation. While they're stuck in repeating patterns, you're breaking yours. And the beauty of it is, you don't have to get involved. You don't have to send reminders. You don't have to check in to see if karma has worked. It's not your job to track it. Your job is to live so fully in alignment with your own values that you never have to fear it. Because here's the truth, karma isn't about revenge, it's about reflection. And for someone who's betrayed you, that reflection can be brutal. The faces change, the settings change, but the results stay the same until they deal with the root cause, themselves. So let them run, let them distract themselves, let them build new stories. The universe doesn't need your help keeping score, it already is. Your silence isn't just a boundary. In the bigger picture, it's a handoff. You're saying, and when you stop carrying what isn't yours, you get lighter. You move faster, and you leave them to walk with the weight they created, whether they admit it or not. Even if they never say it out loud. Even if they keep up the performance for the world to see, there's a version of them that knows exactly what they lost. And that truth, once it's recognized, never really goes away. When someone betrays a good, solid, loyal person, they don't just damage the relationship, they damage something inside themselves. They chip away at their own integrity, their own capacity for peace, and no matter how much they try to distract themselves, they can't undo that fracture. The regret doesn't always come like a storm. It's not dramatic, it's quieter. It seeps in during the moments they least expect, when they hear a certain song, smell a familiar scent, pass a place they once went with you. And in those moments, they remember. They remember the way your presence felt steady, grounded, calming. They remember that no matter how chaotic life got, you were a constant. They remember how rare it was to be understood without having to explain yourself. And they know they won't find that again. Not because you're impossible to replace as a person, but because the version of themselves who had you doesn't exist anymore. Let me give you an example. There was a woman, let's call her Naomi, who was married to a man for over a decade. She was patient, supportive, and genuinely loved him at his worst. But when he betrayed her trust, she didn't explode. She didn't wage war. She just left. Quietly. Completely. Years later, he admitted to a mutual friend, "I've been in other relationships, but I can't relax with anyone. I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't realize how much her steadiness kept me grounded until it was gone." That's the unshakable regret. It's not loud. It's not public. It's in the background of every new connection, every quiet night, every moment when they notice the gap between what they have now and what they once had. From the outside, they might look fine. They might even seem happier. But the mind has a long memory, and emotional memory is the longest of all. It doesn't forget the person who brought them peace. It doesn't forget the calm they felt in your presence. And it certainly doesn't forget that they destroyed it themselves. The Stoics would tell you, that's not your burden to carry. And here's the most important part, your silence preserves that truth. If you were to go back, if you were to reopen the door, you'd give them a chance to soothe the regret, to rewrite the ending, to tell themselves it wasn't that bad. But when you stay gone, you keep the reality intact. It's not about punishing them, it's about honoring yourself. Because while they're carrying that subtle, constant regret, you're building something better. You're creating a life where your worth isn't questioned, where your presence is valued, where peace is the baseline, not the exception. And maybe, just maybe, they'll come to understand what Marcus Aurelius meant when he said, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." You didn't need to destroy them. You just needed to become someone who no longer lives in their shadow. So, if you've ever wondered, do they regret it? Do they realize what they lost? Know this: they do, and that's theirs to carry. Yours is to keep moving without looking back, continuing from the last part of the body where the message was about karma and the weight they carry. And that's where we arrive here at the truth you've probably felt in your bones all along. Your silence was never weakness. It wasn't avoidance. It wasn't surrender. It was a boundary. It was healing. It was emotional discipline in its purest form. From the moment you chose not to react, not to chase, not to argue, you reclaim something most people spend their whole lives searching for: control over your own peace. The world tells us closure comes from the other person, from their apology, their confession, their moment of finally getting it. But the Stoics would tell you, and life will prove, that closure is yours to create. You don't need them to hand it to you. You create closure the moment you decide, I am no longer waiting for someone who isn't coming. And when you do that, something shifts. You stop looking backward for answers. You start building forward for peace. You stop wondering what they're thinking. You start asking yourself what you're becoming. If they remember you, it's not because they can't move on. It's because their conscience never has. The mind can suppress a memory, but the conscience is stubborn. It reminds them that the peace they miss isn't a place, it was a person. And while they carry that, you're walking free. Because the greatest revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's living in a way where their opinion no longer matters. Picture it. You're building a life surrounded by people who value your presence, by moments that bring you joy, by work and passions that keep you growing. And somewhere out there, they're realizing, maybe too late, that they will never be invited back into this life. That's not cruelty, that's clarity. So if you ever feel tempted to break your silence just to check in or see where they're at, stop and ask, would this add to my peace or take from it? Most of the time, the answer will be clear, because the most powerful responses are the ones left unsent. The most unforgettable statements are made without words. And the most unshakable strength is the life you live after the storm. You don't need their closure. You are the closure. So keep walking, keep building, keep protecting your peace, and let your life, the calm, steady, unshakable life they no longer have access to, be the loudest thing they never hear. Natural call to action. If this message spoke to you today, I want to hear from you. Was there a time in your life when silence was your turning point? When walking away gave you more than fighting ever could? Share it in the comments. Your story might be the exact encouragement someone else needs right now. And if you want more daily insights on Stoicism, emotional strength, and the quiet kind of power that changes everything, subscribe to Modern Stoic Notes. Because in a world addicted to noise, we're here to help you master the art of peace.